The trick to installing the fork tube is to put a large blade screwdriver in the split and drive that in a little bit, and then you can slide the tube up through the bottom and it'll go in nice and easy. And then when you're finished setting the height, you just pull the screwdriver out and it's captive. Now when I install the tubes, I make sure that the line I put to show me where the front of the tube is facing me, and that makes sure that the slight kink in the bottom of the tubes on both sides is in the same direction. The other thing I do is set the tube height to 160 millimeters, and that's measured from this shoulder all the way to the top of the tube, like that. Don't do it from this sleeve here, up here. It's the shoulder down here. Now that's usually approximate, because when I put in the toaster tan fork brace, I often have to adjust the tube lengths just a little bit. So after I've got the top plate set and the fork tube height set, I want to tighten the pinch bolt here to hold them in place, and then I'm going to remove the top plate because I have to do some measurements on the fork tubes to get them aligned. Now I'm using a stainless steel bolt, so I applied a little bit of anti-seize, and I'm going to back the torque off on it to only 25 foot-pounds instead of 29, which is the specification. The reason for backing the torque off if you use anti-seize is that it's actually behaving a bit like a lubricant, and so if you put the stock torque on, you actually are increasing the force, and if you're not careful, in some cases you could actually strip some threads. So I'm going to back this off. That's about 13% less from the stock 29 setting to the torque I just put on it at 25. So I'm going to measure the distance between the fork tubes at the top and the middle and the bottom, because I want to make sure they're parallel. And to do that, I use this dial indicator in a jig that I got from CycleWorks. Now, it's a somewhat delicate measurement, particularly as you get toward the bottom, because as you position the jig, you can push the legs apart, or actually, if you grab the leg with a hand, you can cause it to come together. So as I get further down, it takes some patience and gentleness in order to get a good reading. But the way that works is you just take the back end of the jig up against the fork tube on this side, and I try to spread my fingers out just to balance the weight. And then I rotate the jig a little back and forth and look for the minimum reading as I sweep across the other fork tube. Since the fork tubes were a little wide at the bottom, I'm using some wood clamps to squeeze them together, and I let that sit for a couple hours and then go back and take the measurements to see how much change they've made. I also want to check that the two forks are parallel in this direction, meaning they're not pushed ahead or behind each other. And to do that, I use a glass plate and I put it on the fork face, and then I hold it tight with the thumb and then tap. And if one of the edges is not up against the glass, you'll hear the glass ring. I didn't hear anything on that fork leg. And I don't hear anything on that one. So I think the forks are in alignment in this dimension. So that's a good sign. Now I'm going to purposely keep the plate up off the very bottom of the fork so you can hear the difference as you tap the plate when the two fork tubes are not in alignment, meaning one of them is ahead of the other. You hear that? When you hear that, that means they've been pushed, one fork's been pushed ahead of the other. So if you do get that kind of sound, you have to actually bend the forks in such a way that you get them in alignment again. But I don't have to do that on this particular bike. To adjust the forks in the Y plane, I use a large 2x4 as I show here, and orient it so it's behind the fork tube that seems to be behind the other tube. That's usually the fork tube that's ringing from the bottom. I tighten the end of the 2x4 to the rear foot peg with a piece of rope, and then twist a hammer handle in that rope to create the force. I let that sit for 2 hours and then retake the measurements to see how much progress I've made. I want to make sure that the axle is going to slide easily through the fork lowers with no restriction. So I've installed the cartridge emulators, the springs and the spacers, and then hand tightened the two fork tube cap nuts, and also hand tightened the steering stem nut. So I install the fork lower, and they are handed, and this part of it points forward. So I put the spacer in the bottom and shake it to make sure it's flat, and then slide the tube carefully so I don't damage the seal. And then I put the bolt in, and I'm just going to hand tighten it at the moment so that I've got the fork lower installed. And what I want is for the axle to just be that easy. You should be able to just slide it back and forth with your fingers. Now, a problem that I found was that there's a ridge on my axle that had been created here, probably by somebody over tightening it. So I took a flat file and cleaned the ridge off, and then polished it with some 600 grit wet dry. And after I did that, the axle slides right straight through as it should, nice and easy. And this is a good test that you have the fork tubes at the exact same length. If they're off, one of the problems is you won't be able to slide the axle smoothly between the two lowers. Now I want to tighten up the steering stem cap nut to the full torque value of 80 to 85 foot-pounds. However, what I've done is install an old handlebar into the riser on that side, and the reason for that is I'm going to use this and brace myself against the handlebar, so as I torque the bolt, I'm not putting any pressure down here on the fork stops on the lower yoke. Now the reason for that is that if you torque this cap nut and you let the yoke run up against the stop and you twist, you'll actually twist the bottom yoke, and all of the alignment in the forks will disappear. So you have to be very careful when you tighten up that steering stem nut that you don't tweak the forks. The other thing I do when I tighten the cap nut is I use the hook spanner to hold the adjustment nut from spinning while I tighten up the cap nut. And I do that and take it up to about 40 foot-pounds, and then I'll take it all the way up to 80 in a second stage. So there's a certain amount of dancing, so to speak, to do this. And I've got my torque wrench on it set to 40 foot-pounds, hanging on to my hook spanner to keep them from the adjusting nut from spinning, and then I've got the fork handlebar right up against my hip. Okay, and I've got it set. Okay, let's see if we can get 80 on here. There we go. And as I say, one more time. Okay, now it's torqued to 80. I installed the second riser and then finger tightened the two fork tube cap nuts, and I'm going to torque them to 35 foot-pounds, but I'm going to use the same trick with the handlebar. And if I put the handlebar in this side, I can torque that nut, and when I put it in this side, I can torque that nut. Again, I don't want to put any stress on the lower yoke by having it bump up against the stop while I'm twisting this, because that'll affect the fork alignment. So I have just grabbed the handlebar and then torque up this bolt on the top of the fork tube to 35 foot-pounds. Okay, got it. Then what I'll do is just switch the handlebar over to this side so I can torque the other bolt. So I want to remeasure the fork tubes for parallel in both planes. So I'm going to start with the dial indicator. Now that I have the steering stem and fork tube cap bolts tightened, sometimes things will shift on you. Okay, I'm getting about 0 at the top, 0 in the middle, and now the fun one. Yeah, fighting me. Yeah, I'm getting somewhere on the order of a half a thousandth out, which is absolutely not a problem. So they're parallel in that plane, and I'm going to use the glass plate again to check the other plane. Nothing on that side. And nothing on that side. So it's parallel in that plane as well. So the tubes are installed, and time to put the lowers on. So I have both fork tubes installed and the axle, which is free sliding. And I spread just a little bit of fork oil on the tubes to lubricate them. And now I just want to pull it up and see how much stiction I have. So that's what I'm looking for, is a fairly short time for the tubes to drop. 1/1000, 1/1000. So on that order of time. And then as I put in the fender brace and tighten up the bolts, I'll do the test again and see how much stiction adding the fender brace has put into the forks. So I've mounted the fender brace onto this fork and tightened up the bolts to the torque setting. And what I'm looking for is if there's any gap on this side. And I'm going to zoom in, and you're going to see there is a gap on that side. So as you can see right here, there's a gap, and that's true on the back bolt and the front bolt. Now if I tighten this up, it's going to pull the fork legs together, and it's going to increase the stiction in the fork. So I have some thin washers that I'm going to put in as a shim on the front and the back, and then I'm going to tighten up this side. So I'm going to test stiction with these just still loose. Now I've tightened these up and torqued them. Let's see if there's much difference in the stiction. I don't think much changed, so now that I've got those little flat washers in that are thin and used them to shim this side, I think this is good to go. Now that I have the forks aligned and it looks like I have nice low stiction, I'm going to install the fork gaiters. I like to use those to protect the tubes rather than the original ends on the top of the sliders that leave the tubes exposed. However, I don't want to have to readjust anything, so I remove the two sliders along with the fender brace as a unit, and I'll slide it back on. And then up at the top, I'll reinstall the fork springs and spacers, and I'll loosen up the pinch bolts before I torque down the fork top cap nut. That way it'll compress the rings, and then I'll torque these last, and then I'll have everything ready to go on the front end. With the fork springs installed, I can torque the bottom large Allen to secure the slider to the damper rod, but I hang on to the axle to keep it from turning and putting pressure on the steering stops on the lower yoke, because that's just going to twist the forks out of alignment. So I have the forks installed with the new fork gaiters. Everything's ready for the fender and front wheel and disc brake calipers to be installed.